Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and welcome to our 1531st Justice Clearinghouse webinar, Navigating Promotional Processes for Law Enforcement Professionals. During our webinar this morning, Dr. Tanya Meisenholder will moderate a discussion on police promotions. Panelists include Chief Jody Kasper, Captain Kelly Cantrell, Dr. Jeremy Barnum, and Dr. Natalie Todak. The panel will delve into personal experiences with the promotion process, recent research, and recommendations to individuals contemplating promotion and to organizations for improving the process. As I mentioned, our panelist is Tanya Meisenholder, who's the Director of Gender Equity for the Policing Project at the New York University School of Law. In her role, she guides the implementation of the 30 by 30 initiative to advance the representation and experiences of women in policing. She has nearly 30 years of experience in policing, primarily in leadership roles at the New York City Police Department. Then Chief Jody Kasper, who began her municipal policing career in 1998 as a member of the City of Northampton Police Department and served as the Chief of Police from 2015 to 2024. She then transitioned to the island community of Nantucket and currently serves as Nantucket's Chief of Police. Captain Kelly Cantrell has been with the Metropolitan Nashville Police Department since July 2011. Captain Cantrell has worked in several areas of MNPD to include patrol, youth services, juvenile crimes, school safety, strategic development division, and is currently serving as the captain over the Fiscal Affairs Division. Jeremy Barnum is the Deputy Director of Research at the Police Executive Research Forum. He has over a decade of experience working in partnership with law enforcement to carry out actionable research to inform public safety policies, programs, and practices. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Natalie Todak is an associate professor of criminal justice at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. She has a PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the Arizona State University. She uses qualitative and mixed methods to study critical issues in policing. Now, I did want to make sure everyone knew that today's webinar is done in partnership with the 30 by 30 initiative. We truly appreciate our partnership with organizations like 30 by 30 who are so committed to enhancing our profession. Now, briefly, before we begin, I'd like to share with you some information about Justice Clearinghouse. The Justice Clearinghouse is the only peer-to-peer multidisciplinary educational program for justice professionals that offers the instruction and skills necessary to achieve both individual and organizational transformation. Through our year-round virtual conference, our audience and members develop those critical skills that are necessary to positively impact themselves and their communities. And while anyone can attend our live events, our paid members are able to access our content on their own schedule with over 1,500 recorded webinars and are also eligible to receive certificates of attendance that may be used when seeking continuing education credits. So if you're not presently a member, I would invite you to join today and support our work. The last couple of things I'd like to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It will be available to members on the Justice Clearinghouse website. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions you have through the Zoom toolbar, and we'll take as many of those questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. Now, given the remote nature of webinars, our presenters, of course, can't read your body language, so feel free to use that react option on the Zoom toolbar to let them know how you're feeling about what they're sharing. We do have several polling questions incorporated into this webinar, and you'll need to have access to your mouse to participate. And we also have a number of handouts available for this webinar. I'm going to go ahead and put the link where you can download those resources right now or after the webinar, and I'll be sharing them through chat as well. Finally, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback is shared with our presenters and helps shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. With that, I'll go and turn the presentation over to our facilitator for this morning, Dr. Meisenholder. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and Christina and everyone else that takes part in the Justice Clearinghouse webinars. So I'm going to start by talking briefly about the 30 by 30 initiative and what it is. So 30 by 30 was the brainchild of Mo McGaugh and retired Chief Yvonne Roman, and started 4 years ago this month. And it is really intended to improve the police workplace for everyone, with a specific focus on women in policing. Yes, we do want more women in policing because they have unique qualities that we think are beneficial to the profession. We also want to increase the number of women that join policing. But to be clear, we only want women to come into environments that are healthy law enforcement agencies for them to work in. The last thing we want is for people to come into policing and then not want to stay. We've had tremendous success over the past couple of years, and we now have over 400 agencies, federal, campus, local, sheriff, state, that take part in our initiative. So in March, we released our first milestones and momentum report, and that report talks about a number of things. It talks about our progress over the past few years. So I mentioned the agencies that we have, and it talks about the progress that's been made in terms of recruitment strategies, in terms of policy development, including policies that are specifically for women around pregnancy, lactation, equipment, and discrimination and harassment. It talks about the breadth of research that is developed as a result of this initiative, as well as partnerships we have with other organizations that are focused on the same area. So I'd like to point out NALI, the National Association of Women in Law Enforcement, and WIFL, the Women in Federal Law Enforcement, is two of our core partnerships, along with NPI, PERF, and a number of others. So I'm thankful to have Dr. Jeremy Barnum and, of course, Dr. Natalie Todak, who's been with us since the beginning. It also outlines our roadmap for the future and the areas in which we intend to focus on as we continue to move forward. And it dispels common myths about what we are about. So I mentioned briefly at the beginning that, yes, we want to increase the representation of women in policing and improve the police workforce. We also want to reduce bias in assessments. We want to ensure that policing is fair and that everyone has an opportunity to succeed, and that women's unique needs in law enforcement are met. What we're not about is quotas. We're not about stereotyping or pushing women forward just because they're women, and we're not about lowering standards. So all of that information is provided in this report, which is available through the link, and it's also available on our website. So I'll pause for a minute and talk about the current state of women in law enforcement. As you may or may not know, women represent about 13% of law enforcement nationwide. And it varies a bit depending on the type of agency, whether you're referring to state or sheriff or local, but it's been around 13% for many years. We're really thankful to have Chief Jody Kasper on today. The percent of women leaders is around 3%. So she's one of the few women that are leading police organizations in the United States. The last data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that about 19% of women had entered the police academy and remained across the nation, and that was up marginally from 2016. Now I'll turn it over to you, Aaron, for our first poll question.
Absolutely. And that polling question should be open. The question is what is the representation of women in first-line supervision positions such as sergeant or equivalent in your organization? And you can see we've got three options: below 10%, 10 to 30, and above 30%. And we'll give everyone just about another 10 seconds to respond. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here, and I'll share the results. 55% of the audience indicated below 10%, 38% indicated 10 to 30%, and 8% indicated above 30%. Back to you.
So just to close the loop on that question, the representation in leadership that are female in first line supervision hovers around 10%. So by that, we're usually referring to our sergeant rank. And then in our intermediate rank, it's around 8 to 9%. And as I indicated, with our chief level, it's right around 3%. So we talk about the representation of women. We need to consider it from a number of angles. How many people are entering the academy? How many folks are staying? In the academy, what does retention look like compared to their male counterparts, and who's moving up? So one of the reasons that I wanted to show this today was really to think about the topic that we're here to discuss, which is promotions. And one thing that I'll note is that not everyone in law enforcement wants to promote, and that's just fine. You know, wherever you are in your career path, there's nothing wrong with that at all. We have a number of folks that are quite comfortable and have no interest in moving forward. Having said that, one of the concerns that does come up often in 30 by 30 is barriers that might be in the way of people moving up, especially women, in the promotion process. So 30 by 30 is grounded in research and lived experiences. So I will point out a number of things, you know, that we do with respect to research. We talk about the research on the benefits of women in policing. I'm not going to go into that too much today. We also did focus groups with hundreds of women across the United States to hear from about their experiences in policing. And one of the main things they brought up is promotions and the challenges to entry, but also to advancing in their career. We talk broadly about criminal justice research that's related to a number of topics in the employee life cycle, from recruitment, hiring, retention, another of other issues affected the employee life cycle. And we also consider nationwide and agency surveys. So part of the reason that Dr. Natalie Todak today is that we have adapted some of her surveys that she's used and talked about, and many of our agencies have taken part in that. So she'll discuss some of the results of her survey work as we move forward. So that's a bit about 30 by 30 and where we are. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chief Jody Kasper, who's going to talk about her experience as a woman in law enforcement.
Hello, thank you so much. I appreciate that. We can go on to the next slide. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about my journey through the ranks because I wanted to present kind of what is typical for people who are seeking promotion, kind of what's normal and what does it look like to move through a career. Most of us probably know this from working in there, but I wanted to point out a couple of things. So this is my career. I started as a campus police officer in '96 and then joined the Northampton Police Department in 1998, and I was there for 25 years before moving. But you can see kind of in the early days, you know, a lot of years pass between making different ranks. And one of the things I didn't put on here, but I easily could have, is the times that I tried to get promoted and wasn't promoted. I wasn't selected. And it's one of the things that I know sometimes people are nervous to put in for positions because they feel like, oh, there's already a favorite, or they're not going to pick me, or whatever else. But there's really great benefit to going through the process. Even if you're not selected, there's kind of a lot of learning to be done. So without a doubt, a normal progression through the ranks means sometimes not being chosen. And then I have that blue arrow on this slide because it was notable for me in my career where things happened rather suddenly, and that can happen in police departments sometimes for a variety of factors. Sometimes there's groups that have been all hired together and they retire at the same time, or people leave the career for whatever reasons. But when I made captain of operations in 2014, I was just getting my feet under me when our chief of 21 years sat down myself and the other captain and said, "I'm retiring." And so I definitely did not necessarily feel ready to put in for the chief of police of a city after just settling into my job before that for about a year. So I had to really think quite a bit about that. But what I often share with people in classes like this is you really can't control when a door opens. You can really only control whether or not you're willing to walk through it. And so, and it's risky to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about risk later on. But it happens that way sometimes. And my concern always with folks is that, you don't want to have regrets that you should have done something, wish that you would put in for promotion and watch someone else get it when you think, wow, I should have done that. I would have been good at it. And again, even if I hadn't gotten it, there was great benefit going through the process. Next slide, please. So I'll just touch on some of the challenges. And some of the challenges, I'm not going to go over each one of these. You can see them in front of you. But I definitely wanted to call out the challenge of representing all women. When I was named chief in Northampton in 2015, the headlines in the papers didn't read, 20-year veteran of the department chosen as chief or whatever they could have said. They said first female chosen as chief. That's very important for representation, and it's important for, I think, young women, young officers to see that, and it's good. But it does put kind of a lot of pressure on you as you step into that job, because everyone's looking to see, how does a woman do the job? And if you make mistakes, they're like, well, all women make mistakes, because 100% of the female chiefs we've had have made mistakes, right? So there is that added pressure with the position where people are definitely paying attention to you in the way that you're doing your job. And I definitely felt that when I got into my job initially. And then the whole concept of tokenism, and of course the scuttle that you may hear when you earn a promotional position, people may say, well, she got it because she's female, right? And I think I've heard it for other women, and I've heard that, mentioned around different times I've been promoted, whether it's on social media and comments or whatever else it may be. And that's just something, it just kind of comes with the territory to a certain extent. Certainly frustrating. I also happen to be very well qualified. I've written books. I have a couple of graduate degrees, I'm qualified. But to have someone say, well, you got it because you're female, is very difficult. But that's part of it, and learning to let that go. So there's some other challenges here. You can see the list that I created for things that I observed in my career. Let's go to the next slide, look at a polling question, and see if I missed any. So you can type in the chat, what are some other challenges to hiring and retaining women? So feel free to type in there whatever you might like, some things that maybe you've experienced or you've seen with other women candidates, either getting them on the job, retaining them, getting them into specialty assignments. And Aaron, you are going to call out a couple of things that you may see standing out.
I am.
Yep.
So we've got a couple coming through, families, relationships, and physical fitness. And Brenda said harassment, maternity leave, and we'll see a couple of others that come in here. Back to you.
Thank you for that. Definitely. Also, when I teach these classes, I hear a lot about maternity experiences, either people who go and tell their boss that they are pregnant and they're immediately reassigned, or people who need lactation spaces and areas don't have that, and there's a lot of issues around that. So definitely that's something that I've heard. And family challenges of balancing it all is something else that I've heard. So thank you for chiming in on those. Those are some great answers, definitely consistent with things going on in the field. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So I don't like to focus too much on problems, right? We know what those are. We all work in this field. There's certainly some challenges, but what are the things we can do that we can kind of take away and say, this is what I'm going to do? So definitely be proactive about leadership opportunities. And when I've talked about this before, people have said, well, I can't make myself get promoted. I can't make myself a sergeant or a lieutenant, but there's other leadership to consider. So examples might be if you're on a board or a commission, that when they need a vice president or a president, that you're the type of person that raises your hand, right? Getting into those other leadership opportunities, even if maybe not formally within the organization, but in other things that you're engaging in, are great ways to build leadership. Strengthening your professional network is huge. Going to conferences, networking, having people you can call when you have questions, or maybe they've had an experience, they need you for a resource. Professional networks are really important. And then engaging in community outreach. That's a big one. I say that because if you're someone who maybe wants to be a chief one day, the reality, whether we like to think it or not, that a chief position is somewhat political. So having some community support, being a familiar face for your department is really helpful. Preparing for the promotional process is huge. I was a chief of police for 9 years in my old agency, and then I jumped to a new agency out on an island in the middle of the ocean. And when I applied for that, I still reached out to someone to work on assessment center, reading over a resume, preparing things, practicing interview questions, because it just gets you in the mindset and might help you identify areas of weakness or strength that you can kind of work on. And then again, I mentioned earlier, but I do think it's important to say just trying for something and being passed over certainly has value. You learn a lot from the process. It's really helpful. Can I have the next slide, please? The other key takeaway, and I've always enjoyed this picture as far as like your comfort zone and then where exciting things happen. And for me, you know, I worked in a community for a long time where I knew everything. I knew where the best coffee was, and I knew every street and every person and their history. And I had to really step out of my comfort zone to be willing to go to a community that I had very little knowledge about. I didn't have a built-in network in the community. I didn't know the officers, and I knew there would be just a lot of learning. And I would have to put myself into a position where I didn't know a lot. And I was wondering if would I be comfortable with that? Is that something that I want to do? In the end, of course, I decided to take that risk. And I'm so glad that I did. I work in a wonderful department now in a great community. We happen to have 30% of our officers are female. We happen to be a very pro-female department. We have a long history in our community with women's leadership, so it's kind of neat that it trickles into the police department as well. But definitely being able to step outside of your comfort zone is huge. Next slide. Thank you. A few recommendations for everyone. I don't know if anyone on this call has ever gotten a cold call from a police executive recruiter, but they're out there. And you never know when you reach the level of lieutenant or captain or deputy chief or chief, you may pick up the phone sometime and who's on the other end but an executive recruiter from somewhere like the IACP or PERF or other organizations that are helping municipalities out. And are you willing to take that step and be open-minded to taking on a new job? Charlotte Lansinger was an executive recruiter for PERF, and she wrote Command Performance, a Career Guide. This is the second edition, so make sure if you're looking for this book that you look for the second edition. It is a fantastic book, a quick read. It takes 2 hours to read. I would use it more of a guide. If you're going to go through the hiring process, you can kind of chapter by chapter, if you're going for a chief's job or really any executive job with a police department, kind of go through it step by step. She'll have a chapter for your resume, a chapter for what should be in your cover letter, interviewing, assessments. It's a great handbook. I used it for the job that I'm in now to help me build confidence and prepare for it, and it's a great read. A good TED Talk on there that I like, if you're not familiar with imposter syndrome, very interesting concept in the different way that girls and boys are raised, and this TED Talk is a little bit about that. I can't speak enough about the importance of joining these national and some international organizations to build your network. And finally, update your resume today. The last thing you want to see as a hiring committee is a resume that gets handed to you that has the last professional development was 8 years ago. You know, you have to stay current with things. I think of resumes as a very active, fluid document, and my goal is always to add one new thing onto my resume each year. So I'm engaging with it and looking at it. And you can always look at resumes of people who have the jobs that you want and compare it and see what things people who are getting hired have on their resume. So that's a quick overview. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks so much, Chief. We appreciate your insight and your perspectives, and you've been one of our supporters of 30 by 30 since we started. We can't tell you how much we appreciate that. Today, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I really love panel discussions and Q&A. And I recently had the opportunity to meet Captain Kelly Cantrell from Metro Nashville Police Department. So we were really thinking about being able to show the extremes of someone who is at the top of her career and someone that is moving her way up, and where she may or may not land. So I'm excited to have this conversation with Captain Cantrell, and for you all to ask any questions that you might have as well. Captain, thank you so much for joining me today and letting me ask you a couple of questions.
Definitely. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So let's start by asking, I'd like to ask you, can you share a bit about your own experience navigating the promotion process?
Yes. So I joined Metro Nashville Police Department in July of 2011 as a patrol officer after the training academy. I was in patrol for about three and a half years, and then I became a detective with youth services. And while I was a detective there was when the first opportunity came up for me to test for the sergeant promotion. Our minimum years in service is 4 years to test for sergeant. So, of course, I suffered from the same things that Chief Kasper discussed about not feeling ready. And is this really something that I can handle? But I was encouraged by a lot of people to go ahead and take the test. You never know what can happen if you don't participate. So I tested for sergeant in 2016 while I was pregnant with my daughter at the time. And it was definitely a stressful process, especially being pregnant. I think I actually lost weight, which doesn't normally happen. So I did better than I expected. I ranked 18 out of 40 and had my daughter in December. I tested for that in October, had my daughter in December, and then was promoted in May of 2017 to sergeant. So went back to patrol. Our process here after you've been promoted is you have to be in rank 1 year before you can qualify to continue to test. As a sergeant, I had the opportunity to be in patrol, our juvenile crimes task force. And I actually tested the first time for lieutenant in 2019, or in was it 2019? And I was actually coming off of, or actually currently in maternity leave for my son that was born in November of 2018. So the circumstances around that testing, I have always been somebody who prioritizes family. And I think that a lot of women can, I guess, understand that and tend to lean that way. So I definitely did not take as much time to prepare for that process as I probably should have. So I did not perform very well on that. I finished in the bottom portion of the list. I think I was about maybe 10 from the bottom on that list. So it was another 2 years before I had an opportunity to test for lieutenant again. And that time I definitely changed up my mindset. It was 2021, so it was post-pandemic. But I'd always thought that I needed to be somebody else in order to be successful as a leader in the department. I tend to be a more bubbly, positive personality. And I just had to remind myself that there's a place in the department for everybody, and every personality and how you deal with situations. Not everybody has to be the gruff person, and not everybody can be the bubbly person. And so telling myself that it was okay to go into the process just being myself really helped with my confidence in that second process. So I was promoted to lieutenant off that second process in October of 2021. And then I had the opportunity to go to our strategic development division shortly after being promoted to lieutenant and get an inside perspective on our policies, our manual writing, our grants, and kind of the background of how the department is run. And I got my first glimpse into how the promotional process is conducted from the inside. So my supervisor at the time was the one running all those promotions. And then I took the captain's test in 2022, was promoted at the end of 2022, and I was promoted in January of 2023 to captain and placed up here in fiscal, and have been very involved with our budgeting process as well as conducting our promotional processes. Now I took that over from my former supervisor.
Thank you so much for your candor. I think it says a lot when you're willing to talk about the challenges that you faced personally and how you overcame them, and your candor about the lieutenant's exam and not being successful on that first try. I think
Mhm.
it's important for people to hear that. I worked at the NYPD for a long time, and the exams are come along about every 4 or 5 years. So if you don't pass the first time, you really could, a lot can change before the next one comes around. So I appreciate that. I'd like to spend a minute talking about um, your vantage point right now. So you have this unique position to oversee the promotion process
Mhm.
in Metro Nashville Police Department. Could you talk a little bit about what that's like?
Yeah, it's something that I really enjoy. I get the opportunity to work with our vendor who conducts our promotional processes. So I work with our consultant in scheduling, selecting the dates specifically for when that process will occur. And one of the things that I have tried to do since taking that over is be open about when these processes are coming up within the department, so that people can plan accordingly. Because the last thing that I want is for a family event or a pre-planned vacation to be what stands in the way of somebody being able to participate in a process. So if I know that one is coming up at a time of year when people tend to travel, I try to put that out early so that people can plan ahead and account for that. I also get to select, I reach out to our chiefs and or captains, lieutenants, depending on what process we're coming up on, and ask for recommendations on subject matter experts. So I receive those and I vet those. I try to do my research on those personnel to ensure that they would be reliable and a good fit for participating as a subject matter expert. And then we will meet with them prior to the original orientation for that process. Those subject matter experts are the ones that build the test. So myself and the consultant and our Metro HR are there to offer guidance or answer questions, but we select those subject matter experts to really pull from the knowledge and what's currently going on within the department to build the most realistic and updated exercises for the candidates. And when I'm selecting our subject matter experts, I want to make sure that they're selected across all facets of the department. So, we not only make sure that we include men, women, minorities, but I also want to include patrol and specializations, investigations, and so that the entire test is well-rounded and no one participating as a candidate has an automatic built-in advantage.
For sharing that. Before we turn to my final question, I'd like to have Aaron ask a poll question, because assessment centers is not something I'm very familiar with in New York.
Outstanding. All right, the polling question's open. Does your agency use an assessment center for promotions? 3 options: yes, no, and I don't know. And we'll give everyone about another 10 seconds or so. I am guessing, Tanya, that the results are not going to be a huge surprise for you here. 27% of the audience indicated yes, 56% said no, and 17% indicated that they didn't know. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Aaron. That's fascinating. I don't know of any nationwide stats in law enforcement that have information on how common assessment centers So this is really helpful. Captain, I have one final question for you. And, thank you so much for sharing about yourself and about Metro Nashville so well. But what advice do you have for individuals preparing for promotion who may not see themselves in a role, in a leadership role, or reflected in leadership?
It's a little bit more difficult for me to answer because I have not been in that position. I am very fortunate to have had a lot of women within the department who have been upper echelon command staff, deputy chiefs. So the biggest thing that I can say, having not had to do that myself or worry about that myself, is to get out of your comfort zone and to reach out and ask questions. Because when you're preparing for a promotion, you don't know what you don't know. And the only way to kind of figured that out is to reach out to people in that position, whether they're a representative of you or not, and just start asking questions. I love to play the what if game, so I will try to what if everything. And I'll pose those questions to other people that I look up to or people in the position that I want to have and ask them, if you come across this situation, what would you do? Or I will give them what I think I would do and ask them what they would do differently. And then follow up from there and try to kind of just figure my way through that process and helping prepare my mindset to answer questions and think in the position that I'm trying to get into. I know we've really focused on trying to improve our mentorship here at the MMPD. We've got a mentorship program that starts in the training academy to focus mostly on getting our trainees through the academy. But I think that through that beginning process, a lot of those mentorships have maintained relationships throughout the careers. And I think that that is starting to work its way further and further up into the ranks of the department. And so it's a slow process initiating something like that and getting people to participate. But I think that once that snowball starts rolling, that it gains a lot of momentum quickly and it will spread throughout the department as the years go through. I've not been one to do well with study groups, but that's because personally, I've been willing to take the hit on how I score in an assessment center process to prioritize family life over doing a study group that took time away from that. But if you can find a trusted person that you believe will guide you in the right direction, reaching out to them and asking them questions and trying to find out from them what their experiences have been in the rank that they hold or the processes that they've participated in is a good way to do that if you don't have the time or the ability to do a study group.
Thank you so much for sharing those suggestions. And there's that old adage, I think it's proper preparation prevents poor performance. So I love the idea of the what if game and really doing as much of that as possible in addition to whatever academic preparation you need to do. Thanks for sharing. And I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Jeremy Barnum, who's going to talk about some of the work that he has done on promotions in law enforcement.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today. I'm here to talk to you about a report that we did at PERF in partnership with RAND called Promotions in Law Enforcement, High Priority Needs for Improving the Process to Identify and Select the Next Generation of Police Leaders, long title. But first, next slide, please. I'd like to give a brief overview of the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF for short. So for those of you who don't know us, we're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to provide progress in policing. We were founded in 1976, and we have a membership of roughly 3,000 law enforcement leaders from across the United States. We pursue our mission in various ways through research and evaluation, forum and debate of critical issues, direct support to law enforcement agencies, and we put a lot of the products, which is typically the form of reports or toolkits or webinars, freely available on our website. I've listed a few here that are relevant to today's topic on the slide, and they're also available as handouts. The other thing that we do here at PERF is we provide training and development programs. I appreciate Chief Kasper's plug for our Senior Management Institute for Police program, or SMIP. It's a 3-week leadership development program for future police chiefs. And then, of course, the plug for our executive search team, who leads executive searches for police agencies across the country. Our executive search team is fantastic. I highly recommend you reaching out to them if you're interested in pursuing promotion. And I appreciate the plug for Command Performance that was written by Charlotte Lansinger, one of our distinguished executive search consultants. Has a ton of information about planning your career, preparing your application materials, navigating the hiring process, so on and so forth. Again, that's provided as a handout and freely available on our website for those of you who are interested. So back to our report on promotions in law enforcement. The report was done as part of a project called the Priority Criminal Justice Needs Initiative, which is funded by the National Institute of Justice. It's It's a partnership between the RAND Corporation, PERF, RTI International, and the University of Denver. And it aims to identify the most important needs for supporting police, court, and correctional systems across a wide range of topics. It's a 10-year project that hosted 2 to 3 workshops per criminal justice system component a year for 10 years. So that information's all online on RAND's website. A lot of different topics up there if you're interested in learning more about it. We identified police promotions as an ideal topic for the Priority Needs Initiative because, as everyone here knows, leadership is incredibly important in not just policing, but any organization. And police agencies specifically, leadership impacts staff and how they behave, satisfaction with their job, their well-being, so on and so forth. It impacts the organization and how it operates, and ultimately the delivery of public safety services to communities. But if you look at the research literature, there's very little in the way of evidence-based guidance for agencies about how they should be conducting their promotions process to ensure they're selecting the best candidates for leadership roles. And I should say that this particular process focused on mid-level police leaders, everything from sergeant up to major, anything that would be subject to a promotions process and not an appointment. Next slide, please. To give you an idea what the priority needs process looks like, the idea is to convene subject matter experts or stakeholders, and then identify problems related to the topic, and then concrete needs for addressing them. And when I say needs, you can refer to really anything. Usually it's new research, policies or programs, trainings, tools or technologies, whatever is going to give police or the other criminal justice system components support to address that problem. So there's 4 basic steps. We define the scope of the problem, and then we identify and recruit our subject matter experts. It's usually 15 to 20 people. Usually it's mostly law enforcement, but there's also researchers that we typically involve, community members or representatives, could be folks from the private sector, whoever is a stakeholder relevant to the topic that we're exploring. And then we conduct interviews with each expert to develop an initial set of problems. Our third step is to bring everybody to Washington, D.C., and we hold a 1.5-day long workshop in person where the experts participate in a semi-structured discussion based on the interviews that we did, where we finalize our list of problems and identify the associated needs to address them. And then the last step is the experts participate in a voting exercise. It's called the Delphi method for anyone who's interested. And the purpose of the Delphi method is to prioritize the problem and needs into high, medium, and low priority groups. So we understand, if we're going to only be able to address a few things to really move the needle on this topic, what should we go for first? Next slide. So the promotions workshop was held last year at February of 2024, and we identified a total of 47 needs. Our experts identified 26 of those 47 needs as high priority, and we took the liberty of categorizing those needs into 5 themes that are shown here: training and career progression, metrics, methods of assessment, bias, disparity, and barriers, and transparency and organizational justice. And that brings us to our first poll, my first poll question and only poll question on the next slide.
All right, that polling question should be open. In which of the following areas do you believe law enforcement agencies require the most support and guidance to improve promotions in policing? And we've got 5 different options, or 6 different options: training and career progression, metrics to identify successful candidates, methods of assessment, bias, disparity and barriers, transparency, and other. And if you select other, I would love for you to get a little bit more descriptive, if you would, by typing what you're thinking in chat. And we'll give everyone about another 10-15 seconds or so. All right, thank you everyone who participated. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. I'll share those results. All right. Jeremy, 30% said training and career progression, 19% said metrics to identify successful candidates, and 19% methods of assessment. 7% indicated bias, disparity, and barriers, and 14% indicated transparency. No one indicated other. Back to you.
Thank you for that. Super interesting. So here's how the results shaked out based on voting from our expert panel. So this group had much more of a spread across those themes. Our expert panel identified the most needs for methods of assessment, but identified the most high priority needs for bias, disparity, and barriers to promotion. So I'll dig into those just a little bit more, each of those themes just a little bit more, so you know what was discussed at the workshop. Next slide, please. So our expert panel was deeply concerned about the obstacles people face when navigating the promotion process, especially people who belong to protected classes. First, agency policy and culture was identified as sources of barriers for people seeking promotion. Policy barriers generally referred to work-life issues. So one example the panel gave was that when you move into when you get a promotion, it may require changing your schedule to a more unpredictable shift, which can introduce difficulty for caregivers. The cultural biases and disparities that were talked about concerned views about police work. So there's a lot of discussion about the old school views about what constitutes good police work, things like being aggressive or dominant or having command presence. And those things can feed into perceptions about what constitutes a good police leader, but those qualities are not always the best indicators of who will actually be successful in a leadership role. The other issue that the panel recognized was that there's laws in place to protect employees from these issues, but the panel suggested that in a lot of cases, police leaders are not aware of them or not sure how they apply in practice, so they're not utilized, or sometimes the legal protections that are in place can actually be used against people who are seeking promotions. So the needs that people addressed for this issue, panelists recommended new studies on the organizational barriers to promotion to inform the development of new policies and practices that minimize the obstacles candidates may face. And I'm excited that Dr. Todak's here with us because she's sort of paved the way on that type of research, but the panel suggested we need much more of it. And one type of research that the panel specifically talked about was doing case study research, ideally with agencies that have successfully diversified their leadership ranks to identify best practices for further evaluation. The panel was not sure how motivated police leaders would be to tackle the problem, so they talked about how a business case must be made, and that research would be super valuable if it was conducted to calculate the costs of exclusionary practices, and not just the financial costs, but also political and social costs. And finally, the panel talked about developing resources to help police leaders assess whether the agencies are in compliance with existing laws when conducting their promotions, and if not, offer plain language guidance about how to get into compliance. Next slide, please. Another key challenge in police promotions that the panel talked about was the lack of consensus about which traits, qualities, and experiences predict who will be a successful leader. And it's because it's subjective. Everyone has a different definition of what makes a good leader. And also because there's not many studies dedicated towards validating promotional metrics. So there's a lot of ambiguity here. Another major topic of discussion under this theme was job task analysis, which is a really widely accepted tool that informs the development of metrics that reflect the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform a specific role. But the panel talked about how job task analyses are underutilized in policing. So with regards to metrics, the panelists agreed that an important starting point here is just simply taking stock of what metrics are commonly used and preferred by agencies when doing their promotional assessments. And then once the metrics are identified, subjecting them to further study and ideally using longitudinal research designs that track people over time to determine the metric's ability to accurately predict whether someone's successful in that role. That's missing from the research right now. The panelists also had some cool ideas about how this type of research can inform the development of an inventory of validated promotional metrics, not as a prescriptive, this is what you have to measure, but more of a cafeteria style process whereby agencies can decide what they're looking for in a leader and then pick and choose core competencies that they want to assess during their promotional process to properly fill their roles. Finally, the panelists talked about how helpful it would be to establish a job task analysis repository with real world examples and implementation guides to foster their widespread adoption in law enforcement. Next slide, please. So methods of assessment, the panel talked about how there's really no shortage of ways to assess people. There's a lot of them and we know a lot about them. Most agencies use some sort of combination of written exams and interviews or even assessment centers. But each method serves a very specific purpose and has strengths and weaknesses associated with it. And the panel talked about how there's a general lack of awareness in policing about how different assessment methods should be used, either individually or in combination with other methods, to properly and comprehensively evaluate candidates for promotion. The other big issue under this theme was that panels were concerned with was the subjectivity that just naturally comes with including humans in the assessment process as raters or scorers. So on this theme, the panel talked about, especially because there's a lot of research in this area already, but a lot of it's outside of the field of criminology and criminal justice, and it's in areas of industrial and organizational psychology. But just doing a broad scan of literature or a systematic review of existing research and cataloging that empirical evidence, and then using that systematic review to inform the development of resource guides for police agencies to ensure that the selection of those methods and their implementation align with best practices for their use. The panel also talked about the need for evaluative research in this area. First, to test assessment methods within a policing context, because a lot of the research has been done in other professions, but to evaluate other assessment methods in policing that are common but untested. So one that we heard of over and over again was the in-basket exercise, which is fairly common, but we don't really know what it tests or if it really works. And finally, to manage the subjectivity of human raters, the panel talked about the need to develop resources for police leaders to better understand what are the best practices for selecting, training, and overseeing raters in the assessment process, which I understand from the panel discussions, there's a lot there. It just needs to be brought into one place for police leaders to really leverage. Training and career progression. So I think this was the one that was most popular among our audience. Our panelists sort of had some disagreement here. They all believed that agencies do not adequately prepare their employees for promotions, but there was disagreement about how involved agencies should be. One area that the panelists did agree agencies should be involved with and need to do a much better job with is conducting performance evaluations, because those are critical for an officer's career development. And in their current state, they're not done very well. There's also concern about how specific policies or practices in policing disincentivize promotion seeking and thereby career progression, such as, when you're seeking a promotion, you might actually take a salary hit. You might not have access to overtime. You might have more undesirable shifts or lack of control over your assignment. So the panel talked here about the need to develop training programs for supervisors to better prepare them for conducting performance evaluations. Those supervisory conversations were sort of seen as the biggest issue in the performance evaluation process, and getting better feedback from supervisor to officer was seen as a really important thing to improve. They also called for research on assessing the structural aspects of performance evaluation. So, the frequency, maybe moving from a yearly process to a monthly process, so feedback is more timely and relevant. Using open-ended narratives over close-ended questions or scales, so you could really give more constructive feedback. But all of that needs to be sort of subjected to research. The panelists talked a lot about the emerging trend of doing mentorship programs in police agencies and talked about the need to evaluate these for their effectiveness and the best way to implement them so that way they're effective and don't result in unintended consequences of, maybe creating barriers for some people. And finally, the panel talked about the need for exploratory research with officers to better understand those disincentives for promotions and how it impacts career progression in policing so that way it can be addressed. Last theme was transparency and organizational justice, or how agencies communicate with and treat candidates before, during, and after a promotions process. The panel talked a lot about how if officers are unfamiliar with or do not understand the process, they might perceive it as unfair or be discouraged from applying. So the panel talked a lot here about needing a lot more research on the most effective ways of communicating information about promotions with employees, and some of the specific things that they flagged were, how to communicate what a successful candidate looks like and how to prepare to that, how to explain and justify scores in an assessment, how to explain areas of improvement and develop specific action plans for improving to those areas. And there's a lot more in that report, but those were just a few examples. So that's all I have. I was rushing through it because of time. It's just a high level scratch of the surface on what the problems and needs and context was, but I encourage you to check out the full report for the full scoop. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. Really appreciate it. It was a great report, and PERF does have a lot to offer. So I encourage folks to go on their website and check that out. I'm now going to turn it over to our final presenter, Dr. Natalie Todak. Natalie, whenever you're ready.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm going to continue the theme here and talk about women's experiences navigating the police promotions process. And I'm specifically going to talk about the gendered challenges reported by women leaders. And by gendered, I mean stuff they said was unique to women or was different for men and women. And a lot of these actually directly reflect stuff that we've already heard from speakers today. So that's a good validation, I think, of both the stories and the research here. So this is part of a larger project to investigate the underrepresentation of women in U.S. police supervision and leadership. I collected survey and interview data from women of all ranks across the U.S., but today I'm only talking about findings from a small group of the survey responses. So this group includes 226 women who promoted at least once and who answered a open-ended question asking them about the challenges they experienced with the promotions process. So note, these are kind of written responses into a survey box, so they're not in-depth interviews, so the responses are very brief. Slide, please. So here's an overview of the main findings from the analysis of this one question. And again, the percents are out of the 226 people who answered that question. You'll see over 1/3 said that they had no challenges with the process. So these are things like, I promoted every time I tried. 17% said something about the process in their agency being equal for men and women. And then a large portion of responses described challenges that were not specific to gender. So these are things like the exam was poorly designed, they didn't have enough time to study, or they're not a good test taker. But for the remainder of my time here, I'm going to talk about the two categories of gendered challenges that I identified in the data. And these are related to the structure of the promotions process and the organizational culture that was described as kind of spilling over into the promotional process. Slide. Thank you. The first category of responses relates to the structure of the promotions process. Most often, this idea involves subjectivity in the decision-making or biases against women held by people who make promotions decisions in their agency. And the number one response out of all the themes and codes from this question related to biases held by decision makers and the fact that the group was always made up of all men in that participant's agency. Slide, please. So here are a couple examples of these types of responses. These are things that were coded as reflecting biased decision-making when determining who would promote. Most often this story went like, we completed the exam and I placed at the top of the list, but someone else, a man, was promoted instead of me. And many said that this happened without them receiving any kind of feedback or explanation. And then other responses reflected kind of gendered feedback that they got after completing the exam and being unsuccessful, such as you were too bitchy or you didn't dress right. And this was feedback that they felt was specific to them being a woman and that the men who took the exam didn't receive afterwards. Slide, please. So 1/3 of the responses in this theme 1 category related to cronyism, which refers to a process where people are promoted based on who they're friends with or based on their connections. A lot of respondents said that they felt like women in policing are often less connected to social networks. And this is something that pans out a lot in the research. And so they said that that meant that they were disadvantaged when it came to a promotion because the decisions were often based on who you knew. And the phrase good old boys was used by 20 participants verbatim. And so the idea that who gets promoted is who's kind of in that group, which inspired the title of the paper. And the last group of answers in the first category related to work-life balance, so something we've already talked about today. Participants felt that work-life responsibilities impact women's opportunities to prepare for the exam more so than men. For example, this respondent is describing her feeling that the men in her agency had more time to study because women carry more kind of household and childcare responsibilities. Next slide, please. And theme 2 talks about responses are responses that talk about the organizational culture in that person's agency and how that culture impacts promotional decisions and also experiences with the promotions process. So these were things like, I have to work harder to overcome the doubt that people have in my abilities as a leader. Open hostility they faced as they pursued a promotion or after they were successful. The idea that men are groomed for a promotion through mentorship. And like Chief Kasper talked about, kind of the idea that you're accused of being given a promotion because of your gender, because the agency wants to check that box, implying that you didn't actually earn the position. Next slide. Nope, that's where I want to be. Thank you. And here are a couple quotes from the responses illustrating those themes. The first one talks about how women feel like they need to have a lot more experience and accolades in their portfolio or in their background before they can go up for a promotion. And then the last one there talks about when you are successful and you get selected for a promotion, others take away that accomplishment by saying they only got it because they were a woman. Next slide, please. So I have 3 main takeaways here. At the top, if you are an agency looking to promote more women, seek out those agencies that have had more success in promoting women. Obviously, Jeremy just talked about how the expert panel at his promotions workshop discussed that, but maybe that was me, I'm not sure. And then second, actually, back on that point, remember 1/3 of the responses said that they had no challenges and about 10% said that their process was specifically fair for everyone. So that implies that there are places that your agencies can look to if you are struggling with this issue. In the second bullet point, those tips are drawn straight from this study's findings. So things like establishing a diverse promotions board, training decision makers on gender bias awareness, promoting straight from the test, and eliminating quotas. And then lastly, it's important to investigate the larger organizational culture in your agency. Women will be less inclined to seek promotions if they think they'll be ridiculed for trying or discounted when they are successful or disrespected as leaders. And if they feel like they have to put in a lot more years on patrol compared to men before they can be considered, you're going to see fewer women applying or a lot more putting off promotion. And of course, these are exactly the types of goals that 30 by 30 aims to help agencies with. So obviously, they're a great first resource if you're just getting started. And yeah. So real quick, I'll just plug Applied Police Briefings. This is a new resource for people interested in applying evidence in their agency or in their own police practice. We all know it's difficult for a lot of people to gain access to research articles. They're often super long, difficult to kind of pull out the main takeaways. So this website publishes short research briefs that are about 2 to 3 pages long, and they are open access for everyone. And the study I just reviewed is available in a brief in volume 1. I think we're attaching it here to the presentation as well. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I'll pass it back to the group.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And I'll quickly say those applied police briefings are incredible because not many of us have the time or inclination to read some of the academic articles I would like to read. So check those out. And all of Dr. Todak's research is also listed in one of the attachments. Well, I shouldn't say all of it. All of it related to women in promotions is listed in there. And Erin, that wraps it up for today. I hope everyone got a well-rounded view of the work with 30 by 30, some personal experiences from Chief Kasper and Captain Cantrell, and also an overview of the broader research in police promotions, as well as some of the research specific to women in promotions in law enforcement. And I'll turn it back to you to close this out for today.
Fantastic, Dr. Meisenholder, all of our other panelists, great discussion points today. You shared a ton of great information, things that I didn't know. Folks, if you have any questions for our panelists, now's the time to get them into that Zoom toolbar chat or Q&A. And then our next law enforcement webinar is scheduled for April 3rd, and we're going to be talking about managing the retired on active duty employee. I just posted the link to that registration page, but if you'd like to join us for it, you can also go to the Justice Clearinghouse website from the menu bar, select webinar schedule. And again, you'll find that webinar on April 3rd. All right, we've got a few questions that have come in. Tanya, I thought I would direct them towards you, but you can certainly redirect them and anyone else can chime in if that works.
That's great.
Perfect. First question comes from Michelle. What can you share about effective retention techniques?
And I'd love to hear if Chief Kasper or Captain Control had any thoughts on this as well. But I think one of the things you really need to think about with retention is understanding your data and knowing what that looks like. So when are people leaving and why are they leaving? We recently did some work with RTI and we found that a number of agencies are conducting exit interviews and gathering data on exit interviews, but they don't actually use it to inform their agencies. And I think there's a lot of room for thinking about the specific reasons that people are looking to leave and what you can do to support those officers. Chief Kasper, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, sure. I think exit interviews are huge, and every agency should be doing those, sworn and non-sworn, and making sure you do a little bit of research about what the right questions are to ask in that interview, and also do the little bit of research on who should be giving that interview. Certainly, you don't want to lose an employee who might not like the culture, might have had problems with particular people, and then to have those questions being asked by maybe the person they're actually having those problems with. So sometimes I know some organizations actually have their HR, a human resources department, do exit interviews. It's up to every agency to kind of figure out what works best, but that's a huge source of information. And the only other thing I would add for retention is just really what I have found is just always all about culture. And when you have a good, supportive, healthy internal culture, people want to stay. So it's a big part of it, although one of the most challenging things to have impact on. It's really hard.
Thanks, Chief. Captain, anything to add on that one?
I was going to say, I think one of the things that we try to do too is our FOP will send out surveys through the department to try to even get ahead of some of those issues that cause people to leave, and try to identify areas where we can improve. You know, we've had situations where we've been low on staffing and our overtime has gone sky high. And those mandated overtimes over an extended period of time can really impact those retention issues. And so those quality of life issues. And so we try to get ahead of those and identify what those quality of life issues are prior to a large influx of people leaving to try to address them before that happens.
Great plan. Okay, thank you very much. Next question. What would an ideal physical standards test look like to eliminate bias, but while maintaining the essential demands of policing?
Well, so this is another one I'll ask Chief Kasper to join in as well. But to be clear, one of the things that 30 by 30 advocates for is valid assessments. So we know that across the United States, there's wide variation in physical fitness exams, and that some agencies haven't validated those through an independent entity in many years or at all. And so what I mean by that is that physical fitness exam actually measuring what you need in order to be a successful police officer in your jurisdiction, in your area? And that may not be the same across the board. The other thing I'd add is, this is a very difficult topic. What gets people quick to have a discussion on, and it's not an easy answer, and I don't think it's a one size fits all. But for me, it's really about validity, and then understanding your data again, and knowing where people are dropping out and where they might need help. There's nothing wrong with people having tutoring for physical fitness, just like there's nothing wrong with people getting tutoring to pass the academic portion. Anything else to add there, Chief?
It's really not up to us as individual police officers to determine what those standards are. I know many states are going through looking at what is the job, and there are outside organizations that can be hired to look at this. What is the job, and what does a person need to physically be able to do to come on the job and be successful? Certainly some of the things that we've used over the years probably were not that relevant and are likely outdated in many different organizations that still might use those. So we are seeing a lot of changes in those areas, but I could not support more pre-hire fitness assistance. Getting people in, many organizations are doing that. I think it's a great technique to also get buy-in from new employees that are coming in and getting to know people and starting to develop comfort. But getting people really ready to pass those tests, and not just expecting that they're going to be able to go in and run the 1.5 miles or do the push-ups or whatever to do those cold. Frankly, I think we've just seen a generational change where fitness is different, and we really want to make sure that they're ready to pass those tests, because indeed the data really is strong about where we're losing candidates.
All right, great. Next question comes from Timothy. Can you give any advice on how to overcome testing for a position when your agency's history has been a good old boys club?
Chief, I'm gonna pass that one to you and see if you want to take that one.
Yeah, that is a really challenging question. Sometimes I've been asked by people this sort of question, and it's like, should I just leave the agency? Like, is there a certain point where you feel like I'm never going to get promoted here? But things do change. People retire, positions move around, and it's nice to see internal cultures kind of changing and being better for non-traditional candidates going through the process. But one of the things that, unfortunately, and I think I saw it mentioned in some of the research that Dr. Barnum had up, or I think it was that research about needing to be like impassable. Like I saw the stat in there that more women have like their master's degree. Well, other sergeants that might be male have no degree or maybe have a bachelor's degree. That was certainly true for me. Like, you had all of our sergeants, females who were promoted, all had their masters. There were 3 of them in my other department, and none of the males did, right? So you reach a point where, unfortunately, and I hate to have to say this and give this advice, that you just have to really build up a resume that makes you impassable. And so that you really must be taken, make yourself the best candidate for the job. And don't be shy about considering outside opportunities that might be presented to you as well.
I think that's right. A lot of feedback that we get is broadly about promotional processes, and that they're not viewed or perceived as fair by employees. And of course, it differs depending on what state you're in, whether that's civil service, whether it's discretionary, et cetera, and so on. But transparency is really important to me. And Chief, that's great advice. Thank you for that.
Outstanding. Thanks, Chief. Okay, next question goes to Michelle. All of my exit interviews of experienced agents has to do with parenting or being a caretaker. What might a policy regarding 24/7 availability look like in order to retain these employees?
So one thing I would point you to is the 30 by 30 website. We did a webinar on childcare in January. So we talked to a number of people Actually, we spoke to Nashville, we spoke to St. Louis County, we spoke to Seattle and some other agencies about the movement towards childcare. And we'll be pushing out a document in the next couple of months that talks about considerations that need to be made. The other resource I would say is just, perhaps gathering some other policies, or you can reach out to us to talk about what should a parental leave policy entail. And the IACP has some great resources as well. But we know that that's one of the fundamental issues related to people in general, men and women leaving the department is, and another thing to consider is flexible work. Some agencies are not able to do that, or willing, I should say, but to really think about what is it that people that work 24/7 in the type of hard, challenging environment that policing is, and how can you address those needs? So there's not an easy answer to that. I'd also, if you grabbed my contact information, be more than willing to talk through some of that with you.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more question here. It's such a great one from Johnny. What strategies can you recommend for organizations to develop stronger formal talent management process to include ways to integrate something like a 9-box talent grid for equitable development and promotion to align with the performance evaluations?
Yeah. I'm wondering if the person's in the military. I do think that the military sometimes, even though people liken them to law enforcement, I think there's a number of differences on things they do better and things that law enforcement might do better. But one thing that I do think the military tends to do better is making it very clear about the expectations around performance evaluations and how that matches up to your promotions process. My experience and my sense, and I'll be curious to see what Chief Kasper has to say, is that oftentimes, this is not the case in local law enforcement, and that we really don't see that type of thorough, standardized way of assessing folks. My advice would be to, do as much research as you can and push it up and get people to at least start having that conversation and thinking about what those options are. Anything to add, Chief?
Yeah, performance evaluations are a super complicated area, and an area where I think there's so many pitfalls, right? Because a lot of times organizations have them to kind of check a box and they say, yeah, we have them. But a lot of them are really outdated. You're checking things like, do their uniforms look good? Do they use their radio? Do they know the laws? And those are just general, that's just you doing your job. But what are the things that you really want to value in order to have someone promoted? I would think you'd really want to value things like initiative and how they contribute to the workplace, and do they bring up new ideas and all those things? But those are harder to kind of grade and to have raters who are really consistent across all people. So those are the biggest things that I find is you've got, 20 different sergeants, and an officer moves from one shift to another, and all of a sudden their performance evaluation tanks or goes up, right? So that shouldn't happen. It's the same officer. So there's a lot of huge pitfalls around performance evaluation. To be honest with you, I'm still seeking what is the best performance evaluation. I think perhaps an open narrative format is something that I saw suggested by an attorney who really talked about the importance of having good and not creating a false history of somebody's performance by saying, oh yeah, they're great, even though you may know inside that there's something that they could really work on, but people are hesitant to give that feedback. So I would say work to be done in the area of performance evaluations.
Outstanding. Well, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to our audience. I know we're over by a couple of minutes, but we actually didn't even get to all of the questions, and there were some really good ones out there. Dr. Meisenholder, any closing comments you'd like to share?
No, just thank you for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure, Aaron and Christina, and happy to be here and looking forward to our next webinar. And thanks to everyone on the panel and those that showed up to listen today.
Outstanding. Well, thank you everyone from Justice Clearinghouse as well. And with that, this concludes this morning's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Take care, everyone, and please stay safe. Bye now.